time for today's High Beam, and our guest is Alex McCarthy, who is the director of the Tuscarawas County Emergency Management Agency, and also a second guest, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, Alex, good morning. How are you? It looks like everything's calm.
Yeah, so far it's a beautiful morning to be out and about around the county, and I'm happy to bring with me today McKenzie Villatoro, our rather new still EMA Deputy Director over here, just under a year with us now. So we're excited to talk about various topics related to preparedness and, just general topics involving disasters.
And McKenzie, welcome to you. And does it seem like a year or nearly a year already?
It's interesting. I got hired in the middle of the pandemic, and you think, wow, this transition's going to be a little difficult going into the professional world just after graduating college, and then the pandemic happened, and it was even more difficult. But it's been definitely an interesting experience, but I'm pretty grateful for allowing this to be my first step into my career. So
I'm glad to have you. And we were talking before we went on the air. Last week, we had at least two different tornadoes touch down to our east, which is a little unusual, but kind of gives you the red flag, like this can happen at any time, anywhere, can it not?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about tornadic storms in Ohio, people typically picture, that March, April, May period, that peak tornado season, but I mean, depending on just how things set up, we can have tornadoes or severe weather in any month of the year anymore. So it's always important for people to kind of be mindful of the weather and what we could potentially be seeing in any particular day.
Of course, we have had tornadoes in the recent past, even in Tuscarawas County. I remember the one by Sugar Creek not that many years ago, and others of note. So did that kind of refresh everybody's awareness and preparedness, I hope?
Yeah, I mean, around here, statistically, we'll probably get one tornado every 2 to 3 years. So, I mean, thankfully, they're not very common, and more importantly, they tend not to be on the stronger end. But with that having been said, we still want to make sure that people know that when we're under a tornado warning, number one, get into your home. Try to avoid being outside, of course. But if you have a basement, take advantage of that. If you don't have a basement, find an interior room, a closet or a bathroom. Get low and try to cover yourself with some blankets or something just to make sure that you're able to stay safe from flying debris.
So what have you guys as the agency, what have you been working on, or who have you been working with for different projects and preparedness?
So over the last few months, through the summer, we've had two main areas of focus. Number one is on Hazmat Response, and number two is on general resource management. So I'll let McKenzie kind of take it over and talk about Hazmat, and then we'll talk about a little bit of resource management.
Well, Hazmat's, that's pretty wide, right? That can come from almost anywhere.
Oh, yeah. Hazmat can involve hazardous materials, chemicals from different facilities that we have throughout the county, or it can be biological or man-made, really. But our team has really been focusing on the certifications that they need to have to be members of our team. So in the state of Ohio, any fire response person would need to participate in a 40-hour course to get the hazardous materials technician certification. So in March of this year, we had 12 participants obtain that initial certification, and we've been working on different trainings with a couple of different vendors to kind of test their knowledge or test that certification. So in the upcoming weeks, we'll actually have a refresher course to kind of retouch on some things that they learned in March. So
countywide, I mean, is it just a hazmat team, or are there different pockets?
We do have one county-funded hazmat team, and that's through our agency. Our technicians are from various departments throughout Dover, New Philly, Yerkesville, and a couple others. But for the most part, they're all just one team. So,
and I don't know why you volunteer for that, but that's got to be. And again, I'm sure you said another refresher's coming up. You can learn it in the study, but going out in the field, that might be a little different too under pressure.
Oh, yeah. And a couple months ago, we had our annual Hazmat Exercise. So we were able to come together with a couple of our fire departments and actually test our plans that we have in-house to see what processes we're going to run into or any humps or roadblocks that we'll have, so we can adjust our planning period from there. So
Yeah, it's good to get their input on that. So,
yeah.
Well, Alex, what other, I don't know, I guess constantly updating plans and trying to improve, right?
Yeah, well, anytime there's a disaster, emergency management, really above everything, has two main roles during the early hours of it. Number one, just kind of situational awareness, making sure key community partners are aware of what's going on, and making sure agencies are working together to solve the problem. The other thing we do is a lot of resource management. So let's say we have that hazmat emergency or a severe weather event where the emergency responders need additional resources in order to, help save lives, property, and all that. If they don't have resources within their department or their mutual aid partners, those other departments out there who they work closely with, they'll turn to us to try to find additional sources of things. Where can we find other equipment and supplies they need to get their job done? So on a small scale, resource management can just be as simple as us trying to help them find what they need. To a larger extent, if we deal with a major flood, for instance, which unfortunately this valley has dealt with in the past, sometimes there's instances where there might need to be food, supplies, or commodities passed out to the general public to help them recover. In that case, resource management would mean helping local jurisdictions set up facilities where people can come up and get those materials. Other times, we might be managing resources. We might be managing stockpiles of resources for various things. During the pandemic, for instance, we worked with the health department to manage a stockpile of personal protective equipment for local first responders, long-term care facilities, hospitals, and other medical partners. Well, there's certain documentation that needs to be kept. You need to track what you have on hand, who's receiving what resources, or what resources are coming in. So with good plans in place, you'll have all the documentation ahead of time to be able to manage those functions. And that's a lot of what we're doing right now, is just trying to improve those kinds of plans. From other aspects of resource management, we also want to make sure that we have good plans in place for how to manage volunteers during disasters. If something bad were to happen, one of the nice things of being in a community like ours is people like to step up to the plate to try to help. Well, how can we efficiently partner those volunteers with organizations who have a need for volunteers in order to be efficient there? Well, that's one of the planning one of the planning projects we're working on as we speak. The other big item is that whenever you have a big disaster, people like to donate things to try to help, especially disaster survivors. Well, you need to have a good plan in place for how to collect those donations and how to allocate those to survivors in a fair and equitable manner. So that's the other thing that we're really trying to hit hard right now, to make sure we have good plans in place so that the next time we see a big flood, tornado, or other, we're definitely prepared to help people.
Is it difficult when personnel changes, say, in different fire departments, or are you more or less connected with whoever takes over the lead in certain departments that way?
Really depends on the fire department. I mean, oftentimes our communications typically are directly to the fire chiefs or some of their officers, which there's transition there from time to time, but it's not so frequent, at least in my experience so far. The other thing we find is that there's some departments who we communicate with quite frequently. Other departments, it might be on a month or quarterly basis that we really get to see them. So again, it's really dependent on the department or agency out there.
Is there a sense, and either one of you can jump in on this, of community aid that you could use, or different things? That you talked about volunteers, but is there any need for somebody to get a hold of you and say, hey, I would like to do this, or I could do that?
Well, I know right now one of my goals is to try to build up faith-based involvement from a response and recovery standpoint, so that if we do have a disaster that impacts people and homes, actually I'm going to transition this discussion just a little bit. One of the things that I think is really hard to reconcile in this is that when we have a disaster, FEMA's not always going to be able to come in and assist us. There are certain thresholds they look for, and it's really difficult to hit those thresholds, especially in a community like ours where it's not as people are not as clustered together as like the big cities.
Right.
So for us to receive any sort of state or federal aid, typically speaking, we need to have 25 homes that are considered major or destroyed damage by FEMA. With the kinds of incidents we typically get, it'll be a flood in the valley that 4 or 5 homes might see a lot of damage, but we're not going to be able to get FEMA to come in for that. and we're going to be relying on community partners to assist in those kinds of efforts. And historically, faith-based organizations and other community organizations, for that matter, have been very helpful in stepping up and finding some assistance for these homeowners. And what we'd like to do moving forward is try to build some relationships with those local groups in order to just have better plans to kind of help in those smaller situations. When big disasters hit, there's a lot more pots of money that open up. There's a lot more organizations and aid that can come in, which makes it a little bit easier to facilitate recovery during those kinds of instances. But for the smaller disasters where only a handful of people are being impacted, those are the really difficult ones because there's just not as much assistance available.
What is the best way then for someone to get a hold of your agency?
So the best way to reach us is by phone call. So our phone number is 330-308-6670, and we're always staffed between 8 a.m. and 4:30 p.m., and if you leave a message, we'll get back to you as soon as possible.
All right, very good. And McKenzie, you're kind of, again, in your first year, how do you see everything as you're now able to assess it? Is this an organization that you feel good about and are ready to continue on?
Yeah, so my background is actually in geography, GIS. So I essentially wanted to be a map maker when I was in school. And as I was going through the university, I honed in a little bit more on the human impacts on our general area. So my advisor had led me to emergency management, and I really wasn't too sure about it because I didn't have that kind of background. But I interned for an agency for about 1.5 years, and then Alex was willing to take me under his wing, being a fresh college grad, and it's definitely been a learning experience, but it's really honed in on my humanitarian outlook on life. So anything that I can do to help other people around me is definitely worth it. So emergency management does have a special place in my heart. So I'm really thankful that I was able to get into this field. So
we are glad to have you. And you too, Alex, even though you've been around for a while. So thanks for coming in today, both of you. We appreciate it. That's Alex McCarthy, who is the EMA director here in Tuscarawas County, and the Deputy Director, McKenzie Villatoro, here on the BT Morning Show's 8:30 High Beam.